Hello, all. I'm Theresa Gorman. I lead local news ecosystem funding at Democracy Fund. And before I introduce the last panel of the day, I wanted to do a quick thank you to the Media Impact Funders team for 2 days of great speakers and information. So please join me in a quick thanks, and we'll share more thanks later. So thank you so much, MIF team. In today's final panel, we'll be hearing about public policy opportunities to strengthen journalism. There are many funds and policy initiatives taking root from the local to the federal level, which our wonderful panel of speakers will be talking about today. The session will be jam-packed with information, so please make ample use of the chat with your questions throughout. Today's moderator and first speaker, Victor Picard, will weave them into the discussion portion of the session. Victor Picard is professor of media policy and political economy at the University of Pennsylvania and author of Democracy Without Journalism. Victor will be our guide for the rest of the session, and I'm pleased to pass it over to him.
Thank you so much, Theresa. It's such an honor and privilege to be able to moderate this final panel with such fantastic speakers who are all doing vitally important work. And I'm eager for us all to hear from them about some of this work. But first, I've been asked to give a very brief historical sketch of government support for media to sort of contextualize our panel and also show that policy interventions are fairly consistent throughout American history in our media system. The entire notion of government intervention in media often sounds strange to American ears. But if we know US history, we know that government has always been central to news media and journalism, especially in determining how media systems are designed, owned, and operated, which of course have direct implications for whose voices get heard and whose are often silenced. Government was fundamentally involved in founding our first communication network, the postal system, which primarily served as a news dissemination infrastructure. Well into the 1800s, it was primarily composed of newspapers whose delivery was heavily subsidized. These subsidies today would be the equivalent of billions of dollars. And with the founding of each new communication medium, including the telegraph, the telephone, broadcast media, government support was essential. The internet itself was the product of massive public subsidies. Erasing this role, erasing government's crucial role in developing our news media system implicitly positions the market as the sole driver and innovator behind all of our democratic progress. And of course, this is a mainstay of popular discourses and libertarian narratives that suggest that our media merely reflect our desires, supply and demand in the so-called free market. But it's important to know that this miscasts government as either being entirely absent from the field or an impediment to good journalism. And it places key policy decisions as something outside of democratic decision-making. So it's important that we recover this history and to see that for issues as diverse as public interest regulations, media ownership restrictions, and antitrust laws, to name just a few, government has always been involved in our news media. So really the question becomes, how should the government be involved? Should it be involved just in ways that enrich corporations and a few wealthy white men? Or should it be involved in ways that advance a multiracial democracy? There's a growing argument, it's an old argument, but it's beginning to gain steam, that government actually has an affirmative duty. This is being advanced by leading legal thinkers like Martha Minow, that government actually should be mandated to guarantee and protect the press. There's often this kind of knee-jerk reaction against any notion of government getting involved in our media as being antithetical to our core freedoms, especially the First Amendment. But if you look at it historically and from a particular democratic vantage point, you could argue that it's actually government's duty to provide for a free and by implication functional press system. Now, there are further compelling rationales for why government should intervene. I won't go into all of them right now, but there's always been an implicit understanding that the market alone cannot support the media that democracy requires. That journalism is a public good, it's a public service, it is not just a commodity. Now, this is especially true if we look around the world to see how other democracies, to see what they're doing or what they have done in response to various kinds of market failure to support media. This is especially true when you look at these robust public media systems that put ours to shame in many of the leading democracies around the planet. And we can look at these initiatives to broaden our imagination about what's possible in terms of supporting the media we need. But it's also true by looking at our own country's history and not just looking at the postal system and other systemic initiatives, but looking at various experiments throughout history where government is trying to respond to gaps and to failures in the commercial media system. A couple experiments I'll mention. One that I often like to trot out, a fairly obscure experiment, was known as the Los Angeles Municipal newspaper. It was founded during the Progressive era. It was publicly funded. It was referred to as the People's Newspaper, and it showcased a broad range of political perspectives, ranging from conservative Republicans to socialist and labor representatives as well. I also like to point to the Federal Writers Project from the New Deal era, in which the government directly supported writers, journalists, and other cultural workers because the market would not support this kind of work, and it was determined that democratic society needed that kind of work. Now, of course, the establishment of public broadcasting is an especially relevant example after decades of grassroots organizing and key support from a number of foundations. And here I'd like to underscore the importance and the relevance of this historical parallel, because you saw a number of foundations. I know there are a number of journalism funders in the audience, and it's interesting to see how a number of these foundations pooled their resources together to essentially incubate an alternative, what was then an alternative broadcast media system that focused on educational and public affairs programming that wasn't being covered in the commercial media system. And eventually government recognized that this was something that we should put public investments into to help build out the system. And we got the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. So now today, with the collapse of local journalism, I think we could argue that maybe the time has come for other similar kinds of interventions. And indeed, some of them already are happening, and not just at the federal level, as Theresa mentioned earlier, but also at the local, at the municipal and state levels. We're going to be hearing about some of those kinds of initiatives from our panelists momentarily. But I think all of these policy responses can fit under this broader rubric of responding to shortcomings in a market-driven system that fails to guarantee essential news and information, as well as the ability to make our own media, tell our own stories, have our own voices heard for all members of society. A kind of informational redlining, it seems, that these policies are responding to. So with this broader context in mind, hopefully it hasn't been too abstract. It's certainly a harm or a vulnerability in my profession to focus on theory instead of practice. But I think now we can turn to the panelists and hear about these concrete, real-world initiatives that are happening right now. It's my pleasure to begin this conversation with each of the panelists. They each will provide brief presentations about their policy work for about 7 minutes or so. And as Theresa mentioned, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Please feel free to post those questions, and I'll try to integrate them into the conversation. First up, we have Julie Sandorf, who's president of the Revson Foundation, and Graciela Mochkovsky, who's been leading work on the Ad Boost initiative that was implemented in New York City. Please take it away.
You're muted, Julie.
Thank you. You know, after almost 2 years of this, I still haven't gotten the hang of it. Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you for really making such a great case for why public support of media is really an asset and not a liability, and we all appreciate that. The Revson Foundation is primarily a place-based foundation, and our base is New York City. We are involved in lots of journalism efforts, primarily around strengthening local public affairs journalism. And a key piece of that portfolio is a very strong interest in the community media in New York. To give you an idea of how important community media is in New York, we have over 200 community media outlets in New York City alone, and they represent almost 40 different languages spoken and written, and are very often the first read for many, many communities in and around what is the most diverse of cities in the country. In around 2011, we started taking a very hard look at the viability and sustainability of local community media, and saw that, you know, they're literally hanging on by a shoestring, dependent on hyper local advertising, getting thrown in the winds of the digital revolution. And, you know, as a result, we're really stymied and hamstrung in their ability to increase the quality of the coverage in their communities. At the same time, I had this sort of crazy notion as to where likely revenue sources could come from, and asked the question, how much does the city of New York spend in their advertising buys, which are in many ways, if you're talking about public health or housing or education, are targeted to the very communities that community media serves. And we funded an analysis that was conducted by who is now Dean Sarah Bartlett at the Newmark School of Journalism. And the analysis showed that on any given year, the city was spending between $10 and $20 million a year on buying advertising. The vast majority of that money not going to the community media. And it was clear the city had a huge missed opportunity. Through advertising in the community media, they would be doing much better targeting in terms of the audience they wanted to address. And it was far less expensive to advertise in community media, so that they could do far more advertising and cover wider geographic spreads. No one inside the Bloomberg administration was terribly interested, but we did find a fantastic inside champion in the Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs in the de Blasio administration, who carried both the report and this idea to City Hall. And with that, I hand it to Graciela.
Thank you, Julie. So I'm now the executive director of the Center for Community Media at the Newmark J School at CUNY. And before my time, what happened was that the center so is a resource to serve it's actually almost 300 outlets serving communities in New York City. And one of the things the center has done for the past decade almost is to organize, to advocate for the community media and to organize our Newsmaker series, which is a series of news conferences with, for example, mayoral candidates. So when de Blasio was running for mayor, one thing the center did was to ask for his commitment. So the report that Julie was mentioning was given to all of the candidates, and the center asked if they would commit to fix that. There was a question of equity there and a question of how tax dollars were spent in the media sector in the city. And he committed. So when he became mayor, he started working with the, using this research to create what became an executive order 47, that was signed in June 2019. And that executive order mandated 50 city agencies to spend at least 50% of their ad budget for print and online outlets in the community media sector. So the executive order defined community media and mandated that, as I said, at least 50% of the money went to them. And what we did then was to worry about the execution. And I think, Julie, you have a few words about that, and then I'll explain what happened.
Sure. So we were all ecstatic that the executive order was signed by the mayor, but we didn't have a lot of confidence in the city's ability to execute. There's been a 7.5-year history of issuing edicts in this town and with very little follow through. So we went back to the Center for Community Media and said, what would it take financially? What would it take in terms of funding support for you to work with the city and execute an implementation strategy that would be proof of concept? And the stakes were very high, because if in fact a year would pass and there really wasn't a lot of revenues being passed on through this advertising order, everybody could go back, the city could go back and say, well, it didn't work, forget it. And it was, it involved 30 city agencies and a tremendous amount of coordination and honest brokering. And we knew that if there wasn't an independent honest broker, the likelihood of this executive order being executed was not high. And so Graciela took us up on our offer.
Yes, and so what we did is we created this unit. We hired a full-time person, Darlie Gervais, who's been terrific. She used to be the marketing director for the Haitian Times. So she's a person who really knows the community media landscape and who's dealt with the advertising, complications as a community media marketing director. And so we hired Darlie in January 2020. And the idea was that she would be a connector, and she would be a bridge between the marketing directors in the 50 city agencies, the ad agency in New York City, and like other cities in the country, all of the ads, there's some centralization of the ad placement. So the marketing directors in the city agencies, they decide their campaigns and their budgets, but they send the ads to be placed in the outlets to this advertising agency. And so she's established relationships with with the marketing directors and with the ad agency, and she also connected the publishers who didn't have connections with these different offices, and we created a guide with emails and telephone numbers for everyone. We offered transparency, which was critical. There was no transparency in the process. So we wrote a guide and a roadmap for the publishers on how to understand how the system worked, and also for the marketing directors and the ad agency to understand why the community media was so vital and so important. And if they wanted to reach out to communities of color, to immigrant communities, to marginalized communities, the best use of tax dollars was to really place the ads in these outlets that cater directly to those communities. And as Julie was saying, they represent 37 languages other than English. So, if they needed to reach the Chinese community or the Urdu-speaking community or the Spanish-speaking community, the most effective way was to go through these outlets. So what we had created was a directory, and this has also been critical. We have an updated directory of community media outlets in New York City. And the directory was complemented with a map. So the marketing directors can now look at our maps and see if they want most of the placing of the ads is geographical or by community. So you can search by demographic, community, by district, by neighborhood, by zip code. The idea was to make their jobs very easy. We understood that this was not going to succeed unless the jobs of the ad placers was made as easy as possible. So we created a ton of actually elements and shortcuts for them to to be able to do this without having to, this meant in part changing the culture of these, public officers and the ad agency. So we wanted to help to make it smooth, easier for them. We also helped the publishers in creating professional media kits and understanding what was required from them to be the recipients of the ads, and how to also price the ads. We worked with the mayors of operations in the city, the mayor's office of operations. They were the ones monitoring compliance, and we wanted to have the data on where the ads were placed. And so we signed a memorandum of understanding with them, so they would share with us every 3 months the data on where the ads were placed for all of the city agencies, for all of the medias in the city, in the media outlets in the city, so we could actually monitor if they were or not complying with the executive order. And what happened was that 2 months into our project, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. We saw within the next 3 months that most of our publishers lost between 70% and 100% of their ad revenue. Most of that money comes normally from local businesses and from the businesses, the community businesses, and those shuttered. And we thought we were really terrified, and we thought, oh no, by the end of this year, we're going to see just decimation and our list is going to become so small. But at the same time, so we started working really hard with the city to make sure that they comply with the executive order. And what happened at the end of the year, and we started seeing that actually throughout this period, was that more than the city actually instead of 50%, they placed 84% of the print and digital ads in the community media sector. That represented almost $10 million. And that funding saved more than 200 outlets, 224 outlets, I think it was, received part of these ads. Some of them were receiving ads for the city ads for the first time. Some of them saw an incredible increase in the ad dollars. So some went from $700 in a year to $70,000 in a year. We saw increases of 32,000% in ad revenue for many of these outlets. And at the end of the year, we published a full report that is public and is available to you if somebody wants to read it. If you just Google Advertising Boost Initiative CUNY, you will find it is a 40-page report with a lot of testimony and data and the numbers. And we are now crunching the numbers for year 2. We are ending year 2 of this project, and it looks pretty similar. And what happened, the last element is that we created a town hall of publishers, or we hosted a town hall with community media publishers who wanted to ask the city, there was an electoral year, city council to actually pass legislation because an executive order with a new mayor was uncertain. And so we decided to help them craft this open letter to the city government, and also they wanted to make a call to the state government and state legislature, asking for legislation that would, make this executive order in the city more solid and lasting, and also to ask the state to follow suit. And in June this year, City Council passed legislation. The legislation actually expanded the reach of the executive order. It includes now all of the community media sector, including broadcasters that were not included in the first one. So we're going to see, I think, a much higher number next year receiving ads from the city. And then there are efforts ongoing now at the state level to pass legislation on a similar bill. So it's been incredibly successful. And I think we had 10 minutes, so we should probably allow other people to talk.
I mean, if I want to just add the sort of final note, in terms of value for dollar of our investment, I think probably this is one of the best investments we've ever made. And we are going to continue our investment in CCM's Advertising Boost Initiative. Hopefully our board will pass that next week. And the goal is that this whole enterprise will be transferred to an independent office in city government. And so Graciela and her amazing team can take on state government, which has, I mean, exponentially much larger amounts of advertising revenues available to community media, not only downstate, but upstate as well, where community news outlets are hurting as well. So it's been a win-win. And for the city, it was a huge win because they had to get out an enormous amount of public health messaging, and the community media was the best way for them to do it, particularly in harder to reach communities. So it's really been a win-win for everyone.
Thank you, Julie and Graciela. That's such a great story. I'm looking forward to hearing more about all this in the discussion. Next, I would like to invite Joe Torres from Free Press. Would Joe please come to the floor to talk about Media 2070 and other Free Press initiatives? Thank you, Joe. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Victor. So thank you for having for the invite to be on this session, on this panel. Well, I guess I'll start off by saying, when I think of policy, let me start off by saying Media 2070. Media 2070 is a project created by the Black staff at Free Press that's calling for media reparations for the Black community. And our founding director, Alicia Bell, who may be watching in right now, and Colette Watson, I've been fortunate over the past year to work with them. We just celebrated our first year anniversary a couple of days ago. The goal of media reparations is reconciliation and repair, right? So how do we reconcile the history of anti-Black racism in our media system? And then how do we repair it? And the media system means the institutions and when it comes to policy. So how do we reconcile and repair? When I think about policy in right now in the context of Media 2070, I think about three things right now. I think of policy as do no harm, no further harm, no further harm with policymaking when it comes to anti-Black racism, right? And further anti-Black racism, and structurally and institutionally. Reconciled. How do we reconcile the history of anti-Black racism when it's largely still unknown? Part of the thing that we did this past year was when we first launched was to publish an essay that tried to document the history of anti-Black racism in our media system, examples from institutions, whether it was colonial newspapers, or I've been thinking about today, for example, Josephus Daniels. Josephus Daniels was the publisher of the Raleigh News and Observer in 1898. He worked along with the Democratic Party to overthrow a violent overthrow of the multiracial government in Wilmington, North Carolina, in order to further white supremacy, worked with the Democratic Party. I also think about the White Citizens Councils, right, that had a public affairs program that had aired on broadcast stations throughout the country. And I'm thinking about those two examples because we just learned this past week, for example, that AT&T was the inspiration and helped basically fund the creation of One American News Network, right? That played a role in trying to also support a coup of our government, like in 1898 with the first successful coup ever in our nation's history that the Raleigh News and Observer took part in. So how do we reconcile with the history of our media institutions being very much involved in anti-Black racism? We have also our federal government involved. During World War I, the government arrested Black publishers, including A. Philip Randolph, for being opposed to the war. It published a report it published a report during that time, right, in order to further try to pass sedition laws, peacetime sedition laws. It targeted the Black press, right, to try to convince Congress to pass peacetime sedition laws. During World War II, the government also attempted to go after the Black press again to silence them. So, and then when it comes to media policies as well, the government started regulating broadcast industry in in 1927 when it comes to radio. And one of the first licenses it gave out was to the Fellowship Forum, a newspaper that was an organ of the Ku Klux Klan. It allowed broadcasters to oppose integration. And its policy has been a policy of exclusion. 20 years after radio was created, the first Black owner of a radio station appeared in 1949, right? When the radio industry was fully formed. 1973 was the first example of the first Black owner of a broadcast station in Detroit, again, when the commercial television industry was fully formed. In 1969, the Community Relations Service, which is an agency in the Department of Justice, wrote, "Few American institutions have so completely excluded minority group members from influence and control as have the news media. This failure is reflected by general insensitivity and indifference, and is verified by ownership, management, and employment statistics." So we call this Media 2070, our project Media 2070, because starting like in 1922, the Chicago Race Commission came out with a report. The Chicago Race Commission was also like a multiracial body that investigated the causes of the Chicago race riot. And they devoted a significant section of this report to the role of the media. And they wrote in 1922, constant identification of Negroes with certain definitive crimes could have no other effect than to stamp the entire Negro population in the public mind as a general criminal. This in turn contributes to the already existing belief that Negroes as a group are more likely to be criminal than others, and thus they are arrested more readily than others. And we have the Kerner Commission, and we quote the Kerner Commission a lot, but they also said, along with this country as a whole, the press has too long basked in a white world, looking out of it at all, if at all, with white men's eyes and white perspective. That's no longer good enough. The painful process of readjustment as required of the American news media must begin now. That process of readjustment has not happened. We've seen the racial uprisings happen last year, and also the uprisings in newsrooms with the Los Angeles Times apologizing, the Kansas City Star. And we have not truly reckoned with the history of anti-Black racism and racism in our media institutions, in the government sanctioning of this, like allowing of this, like permitting this, right? So where do we go from here, right? Where do we go from here as Victor opened up in a multiracial democracy? People of color, 43% of the population now. Who is journalism serving, especially in this day and age? And every day we're waking up to a different country, right? We're a country that's fast becoming a so-called minority country. It's not a sign of a healthy democracy when people of color are, and the Black community is portrayed in such a way that continues to this day, and do not control our communication infrastructure. And yet, whether it's broadcast stations in the 60s that were broadcasting content for the citizenry to defy the Constitution and don't integrate society, or you have a telecommunications giant supporting a network that is we talk about Facebook that is openly promoting insurrection, right? That's not a sign of a healthy democracy. And so when it comes to federal policies, we have to reconcile that. We have to reconcile that history. And these stories, I'm telling you, there's stories in every city and town across the country will have these stories about the role white media institutions played in harming their communities, right? When it comes to repair, that's a hard part. What repair is the reparations part. How do we repair these harms? Media 2070, that's we're working on that. And there has to be two things that happen. One, you have to stop those who are hurting you from continuing to hurt you. So if we have a media institution that's causing harm, we have to deconstruct this. The idea of, we talk about in our essay, the myth of Black inferiority that the news media has been the chief architect of to this day. we have to address this, right? And we have to address that in our policy making to allow people of color to be able to own and control the construction and distribution of their own narratives. So with that, we have right now, as of 2019, only 1% of all television stations in this country were owned by Black owners. And so what does repair look like? What does a fund like? What is a rep? Not only do we have to stop the harm and dismantle basically the consolidated media system and think about new models, whether it's more publicly funded media, take away the commercial, the commercialization of media. What is a reparative fund look like? These companies are using the public rights away. They're using the public spectrum to make all this money while continuing to do harm to communities of color, to the Black community. There's a lot of money being made. And that's money potentially through policy. We have to think of the use of the public spectrum and the public rights away. How can that money be recouped into a reparative fund to help community of colors build their own institutions and allow policy to also stop the harm from happening, as well as creating new opportunities for folks to own and control our media infrastructure. So I can go on. I have so many things I want to say. I'm sorry, a little jumbled right now because I'm just trying to think of what not to say, as I got a lot of things to say. And so I'll end it there then. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Joe. I really want us to pick up on some of those threads later in the discussion. I'm really grateful that you brought in that important history that we cannot forget. Next, I'd like to invite Steve Waldman to the floor. Steve wears many hats. He's president of Report for America. He's going to talk to us about the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Victor. Well, a very kind of an amazing thing is actually happening right now in Washington, which is there is a real chance that Congress, as part of the reconciliation bill, is going to pass what would amount to the largest injection of federal funds into local media since the postal subsidy in the Founding Fathers era. So let me back up for a second to say where this all came from and what it would do and what happens next. So there are various proposals kicking around Congress for helping local news. One of them was called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. It was proposed by Congresswoman Ann Kirkpatrick of Arizona and a Republican Congressman, Dan Newhouse from Washington State. And nothing much was really happening with it. But then about a year ago, a bunch of the different groups from the local news innovation sector, really almost every group other than the big newspaper chains and the broadcasters, came together in a coalition called the Rebuild Local News Coalition. And it's a very broad group. It represents probably almost 4,000 local newsrooms when you add them all up, and it includes nonprofit newsrooms, Institute for Nonprofit News, the Black newspapers, the Union, the News Guild, the Lion, which is the small newspapers, Hispanic publications, community broadcasters, plus also real funders of innovation like the American Journalism Project and the Lenfest Institute and Solutions Journalism Network and folks like that. And we all decided that our best bet for really profound change was actually the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. And we all kind of changed our strategies as a collective and decided to sort of put aside what our number one priorities were before and really focus on this, trying to get this bill some traction. And I'll spare you the drama of how it all happened, but basically it is a portion of it was included in the reconciliation bill in the House, and there's a pretty decent chance that a portion of it will be included in the Senate reconciliation bill. So the bill has three basic components. These are all tax credits. The first one is a tax credit for consumers to buy local news subscriptions or a tax credit for donors to donate to nonprofit local news organizations. The second credit is a tax credit for small businesses that they can use to buy advertising or sponsorships with local news media. And the third piece is a refundable payroll tax credit that essentially helps to subsidize the salaries of reporters, local reporters through local news organizations. They all have their own logic to them and their own value. I'm going to focus right now on the third one, the payroll tax credit, because that is the piece of this bill that has survived and is now has a real possibility of becoming law. It's a payroll tax credit, which is important for a few reasons. One, it's the one type of credit, tax credit, that both for-profit and nonprofit entities can take advantage of. So this would benefit all nonprofit local news organizations as well as for-profit. It is by definition, as a tax matter, an entitlement. It's not a discretionary spending amount where you're pitting one against another or you run out of money. You have a basic set of criteria, and whatever, if you meet those criteria, you are able to get the benefit. And the benefit is quite substantial. It can be up to $25,000 per reporter in the first year and $15,000 per reporter in years 2 through 5. The bill is set up as a 5-year bill that expires after 5 years. And that is a lot of money. The House version of the bill was scored at just the payroll tax credit was scored at $1.3 billion. The Senate version will be more than that. So, this will pump more money into local news than the entire budget of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting by a lot. And it would be the biggest, infusion of federal money into local news since the 1800s. One thing I also like about it is that it's bottom up. It doesn't require you to hire a lobbyist and go try to appeal to a government agency to give you a grant. If you qualify, you get it. And I think that is going to make it much easier for medium and small sized players, including BIPOC media, Black and Hispanic publishers, to benefit from this. It's one of the reasons why the National Newspaper Association, which is the trade association of Black newspapers, has been a very strong leading supporter on this. Our estimate is that the full LGSA would probably provide about $125 million just to Black publishers over the course of 5 years, which obviously would be by far the biggest case of government or federal government support for Black newspapers. And even just the payroll tax part would be very, very significant. And we think that the benefit to Hispanic publishers will be even larger because there are more of them. So that is basically the way the payroll tax credit works. It's set up essentially as a refund so that you would get, the news organization would actually get a check from the government for up to $25,000. The $25,000 is pegged to the income, topping out at $50,000. So you get a $25,000 benefit for a $50,000 salary. If the salary is $40,000, then the benefit is a little bit lower, which is kind of a cool thing also because it gives a little bit of an incentive for pay increases, which I know the unions will be pointing out when this happens. Now, it is there are really important questions about how you define what a local news organization is, what a local journalist is. Our coalition started off with the premise that we actually think there are a lot of ways the government could help the media that would backfire and have horrible unintended consequences. We are not sort of ideologically opposed to the idea of government help for some of the reasons that Victor said, but we do think that you have to be really careful how you do it. And that's why we like this approach and why we have also as a coalition, in addition to just advocating for passage, have advocated for a lot of very specific changes in the law around the definitions to make it less subjective, make it less likely that there's political interference or manipulation. And we'll see, if we get the language we want, but we're pretty optimistic about it. And basically where it stands right now is in the next week or so, we'll find out if it's in the Senate reconciliation bill. It's looking pretty good because at this point, the bill has been endorsed by Senator Schumer, Senator Wyden, who's the chair of the Finance Committee, and Senator Manchin, as well as Senator Cantwell, the head of the Commerce Committee, and Senator Sinema. So it's a pretty good lineup, but they do have to cut $2 trillion from the budget. So it is possible we'll be alive for 2 minutes and then get cut, but we're going to push really hard to try to get it over the line and try to get this thing into law. If it does pass, our work is not done. It is very important, as Julie was pointing out in the context of New York City's incredible experiment or pilot, that the implementation matters a lot. So we will be working with the IRS on implementation regulations, and also in providing, making sure there's technical assistance to publishers, especially smaller publishers, to make sure they know how to take advantage of this really significant benefit. There are lots of other federal pieces of legislation and ideas that the Rebuild Local News Coalition has advocated for, including taking what Graciela and Julie have done in New York and applying it to the federal government, have half of the federal government's advertising go to local news. They spend at least $1 billion a year on advertising. But our focus right now has been on this bill that is just on the edge of possibly becoming law.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. That was super informative. We'll definitely get into some more details in the discussion. And now I'd like to invite our last speaker to the floor, David Morgan, who is the president of the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association. David, it's all yours.
Well, I thank you. I have the burden of being the last speaker, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. I want to do two things. I want to sort of first talk about our effort to perfect the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, where I really want to, again, thank Steve and the entire coalition for their advocacy work. I'm a career tax lobbyist, so I know firsthand how hard it is to build the momentum and to navigate the bill through the congressional maze. So I remain optimistic that we can work together to save both local and BIPOC media. I also want to talk about some other advocacy efforts that we are engaged in around the infrastructure bill as well, but I'll do that later. But before I even delve into where we are in our position on the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, I think it's instructive to keep in mind, and I think Joe kind of raised a lot of these issues, but let me focusing on a couple things he said. Who owns the story controls the narrative, which in turn shapes reality, the social fabric, and also who wins and loses. And the crisis in Black and brown media has serious economic, social, and political implications for an already fractured America. So let me clarify, MMCA does not oppose a Local Journalism Sustainability Act. We are very much so for helping local media, especially local Black and brown publishers. My primary concern with the bill is that it doesn't go far enough, and that by focusing on local media, it leaves off a large segment of Black and brown BIPOC media that doesn't fit within that definition. Let me give you some examples. We're talking about publications such as Yappy, which is a dynamic publication that's really highly valued in the API community. We're talking about Native News Online, that is one of the primary online publications servicing Native populations. We're talking about Arab America, again, one of the leading publications focusing on the Arab American community. There's so many national publications focused on the Black community. I'll give the plug as an example, and the Latinx community, and I'll use METI as an example. In my opinion, these entities are equally in need of assistance and are incredibly vital to the economic well-being of underserved populations. You know, Joe also mentioned all the historical issues and the challenges around local media, so I won't go into it in much detail. But what I can say is Black and brown media and a lot of these new national publications are struggling to fill in those coverage gaps. And they all have dire straits. And this is equally true for the local legacy publishers as it is for a lot of these new publications. So I think all of them should be addressed now that we have an opportunity. A second concern that I have with the bill, and I think Steve is actually, I'm very pleased with some of his comments that maybe, even if it's not addressing the legislation, maybe subsequently through the implementation process, we can look at, will this bill actually help local publishers? Will they get the technical assistance? As we know, a lot of them are just simply too small and don't have the wherewithal to take advantage of tax incentives. So I'm hoping that that's an area we can work together and build in the technical assistance either at the administrative level or from the philanthropic community. Another concern I have, and you know, again, I don't press this too much because I understand, I've been in town long enough to understand pretty much every legislation has this flaw, but the overwhelming majority of the benefit is going to flow to majority-owned news outlets, some of them which quite candidly are even outright hostile to interests of Black and brown communities and have ownership structures, as you know, we mentioned with hedge funds, that it is not necessarily groups that we would want to be given incentives. But again, I'm not going to hold this legislation, you know, to a higher standard than pretty much all the other pieces of legislation that comes through this town. But here's my biggest concern. My concern is that by focusing on local and not giving equal sort of credence to the plight of Black and brown media, risks zapping the energy of our efforts of addressing this existential threat to Black and brown media. And it will further exacerbate the shameful gap in funding that BIPOC media is receiving from the grant community. A lot of these, even though the overwhelming majority of Black and brown media are currently local, the truth is most of these are dying and, you know, don't have business model that'll take them into the future. And a lot of the new business model, because this is what we work on pretty much day in and day out with our business incubator, are forcing folks to look at models that aren't local in focus. So our position is in no way intended to undermine or question the value or the importance or the contribution of local news stations and publications. It's just meant to highlight the harsh reality that we are, again, as Joe mentioned, choosing to help one group, local media, predominantly white, over another group, Black and brown media, that is arguably even more deserving. Now, I'm extremely encouraged by some of the, you know, the numbers that Steve mentioned about help going to Black and brown, but I am still a little skeptical that this can actually be materialized with the trend lines that I'm seeing. I do think it also begs the question of why there's been so much philanthropic support for the local media advocacy effort and virtually no support for Black and brown media advocacy effort. I would highlight, and we're very grateful to have the Democracy Fund voice as a supporter of our effort here at MMCA, but I really think this is something that the philanthropic community should take a look at. So here is our approach that we think is a win-win. We think funding should be committed to mount an advocacy campaign for both local and Black and brown media, and that the bill can be expanded to include these national Black and brown publishers. We've gotten very encouraging signs from the folks in the House, and quite candidly, we just want to make sure that we are not viewed as being in any way harming the prospect of the Local Journalism Act, but we absolutely think that these provisions should be considered. First, it's the right thing to do. It's hard to argue that these emerging publications that I mentioned aren't equally deserving or aren't playing a critical role for the communities in which they're serving. Second, I think by taking this approach will only strengthen the advocacy coalition. Right now, I think, Steve, there would be more members of the Tri-Caucus, more support from the civil rights community, more support from celebrities and influencers. So it wouldn't just be the NMPA and NHPA, it would be an even bigger, more bolsterous coalition. Third, I don't think even now it's worth the risk of potentially in any way pitting the local media community against the BIPOC media community. Working together, I think it would be way more potent and helpful on both sides. Why should we even think about fighting over a little sliver of the pie when together, I believe we can get a much larger chunk? So as I mentioned, we are going to continue to hopefully work with the Rebuild Local News Coalition, either now or in the implementation process, and I welcome this as opportunity. What we're doing now instead is we're focusing on strengthening our coalition and raising awareness and support for our BIPOC media incubator so we can become more intentional about helping both the local and the national BIPOC outlets. We're also interestingly focusing on the legislative side on securing funding for BIPOC and community media from the pots of money being allocated to community development. For example, the Biden-Harris administration proposed a $10 billion community revitalization fund that, like Steve mentioned, is getting whittled away as it goes through the process. But we've actually worked with the CDFIs to have community media actually viewed as one of the community assets that could be in line for funding under that legislation. We're also, I'd like to plug, in November 18th, we're going to be hosting a summit as we unveil and really officially kick off this coalition that we're hoping will unleash the blinders that has kept public and private community development funders from investing in and partnering with BIPOC and community media as part of their equitable revitalization strategy. So I think where we can all come together is that we should continue to work together to explore every avenue, whether it be legislative, whether it be philanthropic support, or bring in the corporate sector to address what is an incredibly, I think, public policy imperative, which is to save diverse and BIPOC media. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'd like at this point to invite all the panelists back to the floor. If you could please turn on your cameras. And I've got a quick question for each panelist. If I could ask for quick answers in return, so then we can open up to some Q&A with audience members. Already a couple questions have rolled in, and I'm just going to go in the order. This has been such a provocative conversation. There's so much to cover, but I will just go in the order of our presenters and ask quick follow-ups. And I'll start with Julie and Graciela. We often forget that advertising is a kind of subsidy in and of itself. In fact, that's oftentimes the subsidy that we're trying to replace as we think about these public funding models. But you talked about the New York City initiative, and Steve earlier mentioned that we might be able to elevate it to the federal level, but I believe it's also, you're working in California and perhaps some other places to try to implement this as well. Could you briefly tell us about that?
You want me to take that, Julie? Yes. So what we're doing is we're using the New York experience as a pilot. So that's why we've written and done such a thorough report on all of the pieces and all of the process. And what we're doing is we are sharing it with other groups in different states and cities who are trying to replicate it. So we are working with Chicago, with CIMA, the Chicago Independent Media Alliance, who's trying to do the same, replicate it in Chicago. And now there are efforts at the state level in Illinois also. And we are working with our partners, the Media in Color group in California. And there's also efforts there at the city level and at the state level. And what we are doing is we are, usually just offering this pilot and this advice and connecting even public officials inside the New York government with other cities because they are happy to share what they did. To anybody who reaches out to us. And we've gotten groups, coalitions of community media from Cleveland, from Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and other cities reach out because they were interested. And if I may, I wanted to say something to what David was just saying about the community media and Black and Brown media not being local. According to our research, actually, we've done these national maps that are public and they are in our website. We've mapped the entire Black media national sector, the Latino media sector, and we've done immigrant media mapping and directories. And according to our research, actually, most of those sectors are local. I know there are, of course, it's not everyone, and there are many outlets that are national or that serve global communities or that are defined by their identity, but most of it is really local and producing original local content in cities and towns. And we also have a map of the border. So I invite, if anybody wants to see them, you can just go to the CCM website and you enter the map and then the directory, and you can see the type of ownership and the type of coverage. And you will see that most of it is local.
Thank you, Graciela. I have a question for Joe, just sort of a follow-up question. The history that you gave us, it just drives home the fact that our media system has been inherently racist for its entire history. And a lot of this, as you sort of connect those dots, it's being driven by these commercial imperatives. Advertisers have typically valued certain audiences over others, and this has really disadvantaged BIPOC communities. You didn't have a chance to talk about some of the policy initiatives that Free Press is doing, for example, the consortium in New Jersey, but are there particular initiatives that you would call for that help address this? How can we make sure we're not just repairing an already, forever broken system and creating something entirely new? That's the question. That's the hard question, right? Is because, and I'll just say that the media system is been this way is because it serves the purpose of upholding a white racial hierarchy. The narrative is political. And when these first papers began to now, all these examples are giving you what are the kind of institutions you're trying to hold up, holding up white racial hierarchy in their society, right? And they still do that, right? By whose story you tell, how do you cover people of color in a way in which they're not deserving of help and policy, and who's on welfare, who's on that welfare, like how we frame stuff, right? It reinforces a hierarchy. This is what we have to address. Like the consortium in New Jersey is a great example of the government getting involved locally and to help fund a need that's there, especially in a state like Jersey that don't have its own media market, so its own media market within the state. What is a media system that can serve the health and information needs of communities of color? Now, the commercial media system, there are many great journalists out there. I just want to make it clear, I'm not going to end here, right? Working in a commercial media system, doing amazing things. But the commercial media system is often not invested in good journalism, right? And so look at all the money that broadcasters make. And yet there is no really expectation of them to fill this kind of void of journalism, because they don't have to. They're making that's not their purpose, And so we need to get away from this model. We have to find a new model, right? That actually does not harm Black and Brown communities, and also it's
it's about building a stronger democracy. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joe. I think that's a good segue to Steve. And, you know, I think that this question often comes up, a lot of enthusiasm for the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. It's sometimes described as a bridge to the future. You know, there's an assumption that we can try to build on this to create something different. Do you see this as a way to get at what Joe's describing, creating something entirely different, not just shoring up the institutions we already have? And I think this gets at part of David's critique as well. So please address that, Steve.
Well, it is a bridge, but it's a very big bridge. And, you know, in some ways, I think it could actually be a transformative piece of legislation in the same way that the Communications Act or the Postal Subsidy Act was, in the sense that you are for the first time establishing local journalism as a public good and as something that it needs support from the government. I also think that there's a decent chance that this will be shown to be a method that is more likely to help formerly disempowered media in communities of color. You know, I remember early on in our coalition, we were meeting with one of the folks in our coalition is the National Newspaper Publishers Association, which represents hundreds of Black newspapers. And they were saying that, you know, there were these efforts in the past that the federal government was supposed to be spending a bunch of their advertising money in local communities, but it never made it to Black newspapers. And, you know, they could have hired expensive lobbyists to go and try to find someone at the federal government to see if they could convince them to please have some of that money come their way. But as you know, as Joe and David are saying, like the history of that kind of an approach to government support of underserved populations is terrible. And so this is a really different approach where it essentially is directly handing support and empowering local publishers. So for instance, the Baltimore Afro-American, which was started by a formerly enslaved man in Baltimore, would be able to double their editorial staff as a result of this bill. Now, will other publications that, you know, have racist pasts or even presents also benefit from this? Yes. That is the kind of downside of having an entitlement approach. But the help that goes to you know, those institutions and those communities is so strong that I think it will actually provide a bridge. And by the way, one thing that I also like about this is that it's future friendly. If you have a grant program, they have to they tend to write the rules with the current players in mind. But a institution that doesn't even exist now, that comes into existence, you know, in a year, will be able to benefit from this. And, you know, it's not just Black newspapers, it's places like MLK 50 in Memphis or Flint Beat in Michigan that are the new wave of digital only publications or nonprofit publications. They're going to benefit just as much. So I think that, you know, it's a bridge in a technical sense, which is that it expires after 5 years. So I figure we've got 5 years to prove that this is worth keeping. I would, you know, rather it become a kind of something like this becomes a permanent fixture. And the other thing that I would say is that obviously this isn't the be all and end all. Like there's other things we should do in addition to this. You know, having the federal government's advertising go to community media, they spend more than $1 billion. A lot of it goes through social media or network or cable. Why can't that go through local news? That would be $500 million right there, you know, a massive amount of money. And, you know, having the ability to empower consumers of all income levels to be able to spend more on local news subscriptions is a way that you serve the individual and help the business models of local local media. So I think it is sort of both a bridge, but it is also the scale of it is so large that it's a little hard for me to look at it only as a bridge, because it's just, you know, it's on this, it would be the biggest, as I said, the biggest support for local news since the postal subsidy of the founding father era.
All right, on that note, thank you, Steve. Now, David, a question that actually came in through the chat from Karen Ager from the Endowment of Health that I think addresses some of what you were talking about. Do you think there's a way to ensure and now here I'm quoting her, to ensure that local BIPOC media is made aware of these potential opportunities, and those at the state level disseminating the funds will ensure equitable distribution of resources. And another way of saying is, can you imagine a better way of doing this, of the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, so it does go to BIPOC media?
No, thank you for the question. And I'll just use one word that always comes to mind is intentionality, right? And I think the reason why I raised the issue is because I wasn't sure the issue was going to be raised, right? And I think there's one thing to make a theoretical discussion, and then what's the reality on the ground, for the folks and the players. So do I think there are intermediaries that can be empowered to play that role? Absolutely. But it's going to take concerted effort, it's going to take resources, and it's going to take intentionality. And if it doesn't come from Congress, then it has to come from the administration, or it has to come from the philanthropic community or the nonprofit community or groups like ours. But it's not just going to happen. And my fear, and I am very much aware of the data that both Steve and Graciela are mentioning, is that all of these players are important. And we do not know what the composition will look like in 5 years based on the challenges to the local business model. So I don't think, unless there's a good reason, and I'm not sure I understand the good reason for leaving out this group, why they should be left out at this critical juncture.
Thank you so much, David. I think we might have time for one last question, or maybe I'm trying to read through the chat, or maybe we should wrap it up. I do know there was a great question from Theresa Gorman of the Democracy Fund, who was wondering if funders, how funders could get more involved in the policy space and get involved in public policy solutions for journalism. And especially if they're nervous about getting involved, there's often some hesitation. This isn't always the first area that funders go into. But I think we might have to keep that question out there, sort of floating in the ether, and hopefully we can continue the conversation later. I just really want to thank all of you for such a fantastic conversation. There's always so much more to cover. We scratched the surface, so we'll have to get the band together again and carry it on. But I want to hand it over to David Russoda to close us out. But thank you again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Victor. Wow, what a great discussion, and what a great way to end 2 really fantastic days of conversation, connecting, and learning. I'm David Rousseau of the Kaiser Family Foundation and chair of the Media Impact Funders Board. And first of all, I'd like to offer my thanks on behalf of myself, my colleagues on the MIF board, our staff, and all the attendees who came to this session today and yesterday, to the amazing group of speakers who've joined us this year. We all know that the challenges facing journalism today are really heady and at times overwhelming. And we hope our speakers inspired you to meet these times with a sense of innovation and hope. And perhaps most importantly, a renewed mandate to get it right, to do what we can as funders to rebuild journalism with equity at its core, to rebuild journalism that truly serves communities and ultimately democracy. Over the past 2 days, we were reminded by visionaries like Malkia Devich-Cyril that what's good for the people at the margins is mostly good for everyone. We were challenged by nonprofit news organizations like Rizal Philly to imagine journalism as a care industry. What could that reimagination take us? And we were urged by strategists like Sylvia Rivera to fund for the long game and recognize that investments in media are also investments in public health, workforce development, social justice, and democracy. We've managed to successfully gather virtually over the last 2 years, that we really hope, though, that this will be in person next year. A spoken word poet, Hannah Hassan, reminded us when she opened this year's meeting yesterday, truly being in community means being there for each other when times are both good and, well, less good. And we're thankful for all of you, our MIF community. We're also thankful to our sponsors for supporting this year's gathering. Thanks to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Lenfest Institute for Journalism, the Luminum Foundation, and the Facebook Journalism Project. And another thank you to my fellow J-Funder Program Committee members for helping the MIF team organize the content and speakers for this fantastic conference. It really was a team effort. Those committee members are Casey, Wala, Teresa, Feather, Sean, and Karen. Be on the lookout later next week for a message inviting you to share your thoughts about the conference sessions and speakers. Your feedback is really important as we use it to inform next year's conference. And I look forward to seeing all of you in person, hopefully in a not too distant future, and definitely at the 2022 Journalism Funders Gathering. Thanks for sticking with us all at the end. And thanks again to our speakers, planning committee members, and the amazing MIF staff, particularly the fabulous Roshni, Samira, and Marie, who all contributed to making this year's gathering so terrific. Thank you all, and good night.